Hello again, everybody. My name is John D. Healy. I do a podcast. It's called It's Good to Talk, and it sure is good to talk and it's good to listen. My sponsors are Liffey Van Lines, a moving company here in New York City, and they've been around longer than Jeopardy. Speaking of Jeopardy, Austin from Jeopardy will be a guest on my show in a few weeks' time. I keep promising you that. By the time he comes on, I'll have the questions, and of course, Austin will have the answers. I always give a shout out to the Irish Examiner newspaper, Paddy McCarthy, another journalist, writer, entertainer, musician, still, I assume. And it's a great paper to get all your events, and I'm sure you'll be promoting this podcast and the book I'm about to talk about, An Irish Passion for Justice. And today I have the co-writer, Michael Tuberty, on. Last week I had on Robert Polner. So the two gentlemen put the book together. Now, Michael, welcome to the podcast. It's good to talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, Michael. So a little bit about you first, how you got into writing, freelance writing, I guess, and where did you start from? I assume you had some college experience.
Yes, actually, I started out the same way with Rob. We were both writers and eventually editors on our college newspaper at Columbia University.
Okay.
And I also am Irish on both sides of my family, incidentally. I think Rob touched on that a little briefly the other day. My father was a native of County Clare, and my mom's parents were both from County Cork. She also had an aunt who came over to the United States on the Titanic and survived.
Wow,
And
that's interesting.
yeah, and so yes, over the years, after college, all my jobs have basically involved writing and research. For a number of years, I was a librarian for a trade association, and I also have been a longtime blogger. On my blog is called "A Boat Against the Current," which is a reference to the last line of my favorite novel by the Irish American F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby.
All right. Well, I like the title, A Boat Against the Tide. Is that what you call it?
A Boat Against the Current.
A Boat Against the Current. Okay, pretty close. Well, I always say if the wind is against me, I change the sails. So getting back to your own background, like Paul O'Dwyer was the youngest of 11 children in his family. I'm the youngest of 10 in my family. Kind of similar backgrounds. I'm from Mayo, Paul is from Mayo. Rural farm background, which was good. Paul's parents, both his father and his mother, were both school teachers, and Paul's father, I think, like your mother, was a native of County Cork, and he travelled all the way to Bohola in Mayo to take up the job as being a school teacher in the national school. And initially he wasn't very welcome, bit of xenophobia there, I guess. And the church, the Catholic Church, of course, were running the schools at that time after the British got away from taking away our language and our education. So if you want to follow up a bit more, did you know Paul O'Dwyer personally?
No, I did not know Paul O'Dwyer personally, but I guess when I was in my teens and increasingly growing up, he was very much in the news. And he was especially in the mid-1970s when he reached the peak of his political career as New York City Council president. He was really all over the place, and definitely anything relating to the Irish American support for, I guess, the Ulster movement toward justice and reunification with the public. He was omnipresent, really.
Okay.
And so I have, I guess, over the years, I never met him, but I certainly followed him in the news.
Okay. Well, we touched on some of those things. I believe, and I know he was like a conduit for the Good Friday Agreement, because when he had a meeting with President Bill Clinton at the time, he encouraged Bill Clinton to get the visa for Gerry Adams being the president of Sinn Féin IRA at the time, because, of course, it would have been difficult for Gerry to get a visa if there wasn't some connection. At that time, I was very active in Ireland myself. I was helping out with people with disabilities and that, and I had a group visiting Jean Kennedy Smith's residence in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. She was the ambassador from the US to Ireland at the time. So it was an easy phone call for Bill Clinton to call Jean Kennedy Smith and help Gerry Adams get the visa. And that's how Gerry Adams was able to get into America. And then I was there shortly after that too, and he was able to get on the Larry King show. His opponent was Ken McGuinness, who would also be his enemy per se, okay? And at the end of that interview, just so you know, Larry King, after a long debate about the troubles in Northern Ireland and so on and so forth, because it was a difficult time in the 60s, and Larry King asked the two gentlemen if they would shake hands. And Gerry Adams held his hand out, and Ken McGuinness folded his arms. So it was kind of a strange. Yeah. The following Monday, I was actually on another TV show, and I emphasized the importance of it's good to talk. I said, if we can't talk to our enemies, we can't solve what needs to be solved. Not even touch it, not even scratch it. We first need to talk. And that's why my podcast is called It's Good to Talk. My guest is Michael Tuberty, and we're talking about the life and times of Paul O'Dwyer from Bohola. So give us some more of your research.
Yes. So as part of that, and the book title again is An Irish Passion for Justice. Interviews with 100 different people in the course of this, including a number of people that were involved later on in Paul's life with the drive for justice and reunification in Ulster. Neil Dowd, who I guess you had referred to in the prior podcast with Rob, was one of them. There were a number of other, including younger people along the way that we either interviewed by phone or by email, including Cormac O'Malley. And one of the other aspects of this, of Paul's effort in this case, was it was really culminated, obviously, with the appearance of Gerry Adams here in the U.S. and Bill Clinton moving to and appoint a special envoy. But what really struck Rob and myself was that this was really the culmination of a multi-front and multi-decade effort on Paul's part to bring justice to the area. He had started initially very hopeful that the civil rights movement in Ulster was going to affect change, and it didn't right away. Later on, he became involved, and his firm, O'Dwyer and Bernstein, became involved with representing, I guess, NORAID, and they were kind of also kind of a go-to firm for anybody that was accused by the federal government of involvement with, for instance, shipping arms. And one such case was the Fort Worth 5 case. And then later on, there was in the early 1980s, there was a gun running case, I guess, involving Michael Flannery and George Harrison, among other people. But the other aspect of it, besides this kind of legal work, was that Paul made a real point to reach out to younger people and to set up organizations that would press in terms of lobbying Congress and going to newspapers. So one, for instance, I think was the Irish Committee for Ulster Justice.
Okay.
Another aspect of it, which is sometimes forgotten about these days, in the 1970s and for a large part of the 1980s, the main conduit for American reception of news about Ireland was what American reporters were receiving from London. The New York Times and the AP, for instance, had no bureau of their own reporting there, so they were basically getting their scraps from news from Ulster from UK sources, which were obviously biased.
Yes, I was about to say that, yeah.
Yeah, and so what Paul did, number one, he set in motion, I guess, for a young reporter, Jim Mulvaney, to get a journalism fellowship so he could report on the ground there.
Yes.
And then in the late 1980s, Paul mobilized a number of New York politicians, such as David Dinkins, and also a progressive lawyer from the UK, Richard Harvey, to protest outside the New York Times headquarters in New York when they were really not reporting at all about the murder of the lawyer Finucane. Yeah.
Yes.
So Paul was 81 years old at that point, and he got on a bullhorn and was protesting out there. So he was really indomitable for a quarter century in this fight.
Absolutely. I had another historian on a few times here, Brian Layden. He is from there. He wrote 3 books, one called The Home Place and Summer '69, and he also has a new book out. I did a long podcast with him over a year ago about the Good Friday Agreement, okay? And the basis of it was that what Michael Collins had signed with the British back in 1921-22, the original one, was pretty much the same as the Good Friday Agreement. The difference being, and Brian Layden explained this extremely clearly actually, was when Bill Clinton and the American side got involved, and especially Senator George Mitchell and people like Neil O'Dowd and Paul O'Dwyer and everyone else that got involved, the British paid more attention. Up to that point, they were very much giving the finger to the problem, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
But when the US became involved, be it love or war, or case may be, they felt more compelled to start working on this problem. After all, they gave up India, they gave up Canada. Why can't you go up a little back garden in Northern Ireland, you know?
Not to mention Hong Kong.
Not to mention Hong Kong. And I had Brian on recently talking about the European elections and the fact that the UK left Europe. They forgot they were had on tow Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK, until the Good Friday Agreement is completely achieved in all its goals and aims. And that will happen, I can assure you, because I'm working on that myself personally. So now the people in Northern Ireland can't have a vote in Europe to select their MEPs, which is really, really bad and unfair and unjust, because the people in Northern Ireland in their section voted to remain in Europe. England voted by only 51% to leave Europe, a market of over 500 million consumers. I mean, how dumb is anyone leaving that market? But let's go back to Paul O'Dwyer and yourself. Give us some more, like he was friends with Jimmy Breslin, I believe, yeah?
That's right. Jimmy Breslin, and really from, I think, very early in Breslin's career. And he was also friends with Pete Hamill, another columnist in New York. Yet a third columnist, Murray Kempton, also greatly admired Paul. So yeah, I think Paul definitely reached out to all of these and was very agreeable and candid in speaking to reporters.
Right, that was excellent. Because I think Jimmy Breslin wrote, I think, a book, if I'm correct. It was called No Way to See the Future If We Can't See the Present. No Way to the Future If We Can't See the Present. And I think Paul obviously endorsed the book with some humor as well, and said it should be put out in large print, which was just the irony of the story.
One of the things that I discovered that was really a very pleasant aspect of the life of Paul and his personality was his very dry wit.
Okay.
Paul liked to tell the story about when he was driving in Ireland with his first wife, Kathleen. And at one point, Paul asked her, how many great men have you known in your life, Kathleen? And she said, well, I can't say exactly, but there's one less than you think, dear.
Okay, good.
And then Ron, when he was on the city council and the council was considering a major construction project, he actually had a bishop in San Antonio call up and was recommending, I guess, a principal at one of the companies that was applying for the project. This bishop hailed this businessman for his Catholic values and what a wonderful father of 14 people he was. Mm-hmm. And after Paul got off the phone with him, Paul said, that poor woman.
Indeed. When I had Brian Layden on recently too, he gave another kind of example of divorce in Ireland, because the divorce back in the day wasn't that common. And then because of the Catholic Church, obviously, and then it became like everywhere. And Paul gives a story about, we were kind of slagging divorce attorneys, okay? And Paul said, you heard the story about the Irish farmer and his wife, and they're having a divorce. And the farmer has the head of the cow pulling it one way, and his wife has the tail of the cow pulling it the other way. And the divorce attorney's in the middle milking the cow. It sounds about right. Even on Fifth Avenue, you could see that, couldn't you? Or Park Avenue, definitely. So big shout out to Brian Layden, for his humor and wit, because we did cover the European elections in detail, and that podcast is out as well. You can catch up on it. And the Good Friday Agreement, that's worth catching too. I'm going to interrupt now, because as a young man, I bring on usually to sing a song for you, Mr. Tuberty, and for myself and for my listeners. And his name is Jimmy Grady. He's winning lots of competitions. He's only 13 years old. When I met him first, he was 10. He's getting old very quickly, which makes me older. And he's going to sing a song today, which is very reminiscent of County Mayo, especially if you grew up on a farm like myself and Paula Dwyer, and you wake up on a May morning. It's called the May Morning Dew, D-E-W. So he's winning another award. So let's let him sing. I'll come back to you and we'll pick up where we left off.
How pleasant in winter to sit by the clock, listening to the barks and the howls of a dog, or in summer to wander the wide valleys through, and to pluck the wild flowers in the May morning dew. Summer is coming, oh, summer is near, with the leaves on the trees and the sky blue and clear. And the small birds are singing their fond notes so true, and the wildflowers are springing in the May morning dew. The house I was born in is but a stone on a stone, and all round the garden the weeds they have grown, and all the fine neighbors that ever I knew, like the red rose, have perished in the May morning dew. God be with the old folks, they are all dead and gone. And likewise my brothers, young Dennis and John, as we trip through the heather, wild hares to pursue. Our joys they did mingle in the May morning dew.
So I'm back to you now again. My name is John D. Healy. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk. My guest is Michael Tuberty, and the book today is called An Irish Passion for Justice, and it's about the life and times of Paul O'Dwyer and what he advocated for and how he worked so hard and how it was instilled in him from his roots in Bohola in County Mayo. There's a song about Bohola actually called There Are Only Three Pubs in Bohola, as everybody knows. And that song was made famous by Brendan Shine from Athlone. And it's a very popular song. And actually, there are only three pubs in Bohola, as everybody knows, a church and a post office. Now, speaking of the church, when Paul's parents were school teachers in Bohola, the parish priest actually fired Paul's mother from being a teacher because she was on the seventh baby.
Correct.
The priest was against that, and I think it resonated with Paul as well. And I'm not a big fan of the church being involved in managing schools or managing pretty much anything. I think when the church and the government get into bed together, bad things happen. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one aspect of what happened there with his mother, part of it did have to do with the pregnancy following the seventh child, but the O'Dwyer family also, and I think not without reason, thought of it as the priest firing the mother as a way to strike back at Patrick O'Dwyer, Paul's father, for his involvement in an Irish national teaching organization.
Right.
Patrick was, I think, one of the pioneering organizers in the area. And the priest at that point had been looking for some time to try to replace Patrick, but he couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. So he struck at Bridget O'Dwyer instead. Paul actually made a point in a memoir of his brother Bill's that he edited late in his life. And the comment he made was that the firing of his mother meant almost near economic catastrophe for the family.
Definitely.
And he had to really, the family had to, and I guess Bridget especially had to really hustle to try to make ends meet. I think you're right about Paul's real ambivalence about the church, and I do stress ambivalence. It's not hatred, but he was skeptical about how far it should get involved with, for want of a better term, secular or government affairs. Right. And I think that he later on in life, there certainly were priests, and one group, the Carmelite order, which was very prominent in Mayo, he especially liked, and part of it was that particular order during the Irish War of Independence had been really very unique among all the orders in Ireland in terms of aiding Irish patriots in the struggle for independence. They would hide them and give them aid wherever they could. Archbishops at that point. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
They were known as safe houses.
Correct.
So safe as in the people on the run would know a house, and indeed the O'Dwyer homestead was known as a safe house. So if you were on the run from the British, they could hide you for a few days or maybe a few weeks. The other
That's correct.
That comes up about Paul's mother and Paul's own education, because at the time secondary school education wasn't free then. And as you alluded to there, like money was tight because she no longer had a job. So she got him to saddle up the pony and trap. And on a rainy day, they travelled all the way to Ballyhedreen, which is on the border of Mayo and Roscommon, okay? And it's a good distance. And she went in, and she must have been quite an eloquent and persuasive woman. The fee for the school was £15 a year, and she was able to persuade the school that all she could afford was £10. And whoever was the principal of the school said, okay, let's make the deal. You'll find this one interesting, Michael Tuberty. Years and years and years later, Paul got slagged off a lot from his friends by saying that because of the poverty, he wasn't able to pay for his education. So when he came up the ranks as an attorney here in New York, he wrote a check in dollars for the equivalent of the £15 plus interest, and he mailed it to the school in Ballyhadreen. So you can imagine the surprise of the school saying this student, after all these years, probably 40 years at least, maybe more, has paid for his fees finally.
Yes, he did actually relate that later on in life, and we mentioned it in the course of our book. And you touched on, I think, just the economic struggle that the family had, and of course that led, I guess, all the O'Dwyer males in the family, and Paul was the youngest to emigrate over to the United States. I think really that was obviously a source of some pain, I guess,
Yes.
to his mother that all of them had left, but that was all too common a situation in Ireland, all over Ireland at that point.
Well, especially in Mayo, and that's where word comes from, because I speak my native language still. I don't know if you ever come across the word mehel. Mehel Mayo means teamwork.
Yes.
So like myself, if I'm the youngest of 10 or Paul was the youngest of 11, all the other brothers and sisters help everyone else up the line. So in other words, he obviously came by ship, by boat to America. I came on a 747 Aer Lingus, a little bit more privileged. But, you know, someone is helping you finance it to get you to it. My own education was paid for by my granduncle. And just like Paul, I studied at St. John's University in Queens, and Paul studied law, I studied marketing. And incidentally, about St. John's and Queens, lots of Paul's work, I'm sure you know this, are stored in the archives in St. John's University, which is interesting. It's worth looking into.
Yes, we made use of that in
you
the
did?
course
Okay.
of it. And the other aspect of, I think, how St. John's really, in a sense, changed the course of Paul's life, if you will. Obviously, it started him on his legal career, excuse me,
You're okay.
but it also exposed him to a number of people outside the Irish experience. He had, for instance, a number of Jewish classmates, and he became impressed by their intelligence, zeal, and humanity. And in the course of that, he made a great number of friends that he would keep through much of his legal career. I think it also played a part later on during World War II, as the condition of European Jewry became really frightening because of the ongoing Holocaust, and movement grew in the United States for a Jewish homeland. And Paul became very involved with that, and he helped defend a couple of gun runners, for instance, and he also did a lot of promotional work for this Bergson group that was pressing for independence for Israel. So I think the St. John's played a major part in his life.
Excellent. Well, Paul was born in 1907. He died in 1974. His ashes are actually scattered in his hometown of the Hole in County Mayo. And he was instrumental as well in setting up a what's known as Cheshire Home. It's a respite centre for adult men and women with physical disabilities. I was very involved, closely similar, with the Irish Wheelchair Association, IWA, and they're a great organisation as well. But Cheshire Home is still going strong. Shout out to my friends there too, especially Kevin Burke from Rehab in Mayo. And it's the resilience of Mayo people too, to help people less privileged than themselves. And Paul was, he was, I guess you could call him the first and best Mayo person. I think he won an award from the Mayo Society. I think that was in 1974. He was made Mayo Man of the Year. Speaking of the Mayo Society, Michael, your book and Robert's book was presented to me only 3 weeks ago by the president and vice president of the Mayo Society here in New York City. That would be Michael Kieran McAndrew and Maureen Gibbons. Kieran being the president and Maureen Gibbons being the vice president. And that's where I met your colleague, Robert. He had a book signing there. So they presented the book to me for my efforts on the podcast of helping Mayo events and things that happen in Mayo indeed. And lots of things are happening in Mayo as we speak. The local elections are on right now, and it's a busy time of the year. June is coming up for local elections and European elections. So let's continue on a little bit more about the book, Michael. It's a fine publication.
Thank you.
And Robert should be very proud of your achievements. I know what it's like to publish a book because I published a book myself at the beginning of the COVID. It wasn't easy. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and effort and editing and proofreading, of course, as you must be an expert in that because that's what you do. So tell me more about you.
I've had a lot of experience with it, and especially in the course of this book. Collaborating with Rob was great, and we've known each other for well over 40 years.
Okay.
And he's really a fast and a fluid writer, and he made so many contacts when he was covering City Hall that helped us immeasurably when we went out to interview people.
Very good. Well, it's all about people, isn't it? It's good to talk, you know?
Absolutely.
I mean, words matter, words can hurt, and words can divide, and words can heal. I don't know who said that, but I just said it now. Anyways, tell me, Michael, where can people purchase the book? Because I was fortunate enough to get mine as a complimentary copy.
Yes, there are two places. The publisher is Cornell University Press.
Okay.
So you could go to their website, cornellpress.cornell.edu, and then also on Amazon. Those are probably the two quickest ways to do that.
Yeah, my book is on Amazon. That's my book, by the way, and that's how it all started by Stone McGarn. That book is on Amazon as well, and then I put it on audio. Good for you. Put it up your book too. Like we say in high school, I'll show you mine if you showed me yours. Joke, of course. So I was mentioned Brian Layden, and his new book is out too, and we check out his podcast, and a number of other people were on podcasts. There's over 150 podcasts out there, so there's a lot of stuff. I usually cover history and music as well, and sports. More to know that. European elections coming up. I will have Brian Layden back when the European elections are over to do some analysis as to who won, who didn't. There are 27 countries in Europe that will be voting in the European elections. The UK are out. There would have been 28 otherwise. 27 countries in Europe deciding the future of Europe in the European Parliament. Very important election for future, of course. So I'm going to sign out in my native Irish language, and we'll tune out with the anthem of Europe, beautiful anthem written by Beethoven. It's called Ode to Joy, actually. So, Michael, thank you for being on the podcast. It's good to talk, and very good to talk with you today. And I
thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful speaking to you, John.
Thank you. And we'll, if I get inquiries, I will put them your way. People can email me at jhfornews@yahoo.com. I do get a lot of questions in, sometimes critical, but you've got to take the go to bed. So I'm going to say Slán Abhaile, which means goodbye for now. I'm going to say Sin Scéal means that's the story. Agus Bé Scéal Eile means we will have another story. Okay, so till next time.
Till next time. Thank you again.